Okay. So just get rid of this. Sorry, I'm just trying to figure out how to get this out of my way so I can see other things. Is there any suggestions?
Just click anywhere on the screen.
Okay, there we go. Okay. All right, so welcome to Makat Bechorot, the last of the Makot in the Order of the Seder series of Web Yeshiva. So Makat Bechorot is not simply the 10th Makkah. It's not only the last of all of the Makot that were brought upon Egypt in the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim. It is possibly the most important moment of the whole story, one could argue, because it is not only the end of the plagues, it's also the very moment of Yetziat Mitzrayim. So if you look at the psukim, the central psukim of this part of the story, so we're in Perek Yud Bet of Sefer Shmot, right? So in Pasuk Yud Aleph, it says, and I'll translate in case someone needs that. V'kacha tochlu oto. Right. So this is talking about the korban Pesach, which is happening kind of simultaneously, right? The Pesach sacrifice, which is happening simultaneously with hello to the person who just signed in. Let me backtrack a moment. At this moment of Makat Bechorot, this is when we first hear the term Pesach, right? The term which, of course, becomes the name of the holiday. But the word Pesach, or the root of the word Pesach, shows up in two different ways. It shows up once as a verb and once as a noun. So first, in Pasuk Yud Aleph, right, the 11th verse of chapter Yud Bet, it says about the korban Pesach, about the Pesach sacrifice, V'chacha tochlu oto. This is how you're supposed to eat it, the korban, the Pesach sacrifice. Motnechem chagurim, your belts, right, should be girded, right? You should be dressed properly. Na'alechem beraglechem, your shoes should be on your feet. Umakelchem biyetchem, and your walking sticks should be in your hands, meaning you should be ready to go out the door. Ve'achaltem oto bechipazon, you should eat it, the sacrifice, bechipazon, hastily. Pesach hu la'Hashem. It is a Pesach for God. Okay, so the simplest reading of the pasuk is that the Pesach is the name of the korban, which is true in all cases. This is Pesach for God, the sacrifice that you were doing for God. We're going to get back to that phrase. Okay, so that's the first time the first context of the word or the root of Pesach. And here it appears as a noun, right? The sacrifice that B'nei Yisrael have to make as they are leaving Egypt. If you skip to Pasuk Yud Gimel, right, the 13th Pasuk, right, and we have one Pasuk missing in the middle, which we'll address in a moment. V'haya hadam lachem leot al habatim, right? So previously it said that when they sacrificed the Pesach sacrifice, the Passover sacrifice, they had to take the blood of the sacrifice and put it upon the door, right, of the two sides of the door and the lintel on top, and this, right, the blood, v'haya hadam lachem leot, this will be a sign, the blood will be a sign, al habatim, upon your houses, ater asher atem sham, the houses in which you are, v'ra'iti et hadam, and Hashem, God says, I will see the blood, ufasachti alechem, I will Pesach over you. I will Pasach over you. We'll discuss exactly what the meaning of that is in a moment. V'lo yiyeh v'chem negef lamashchit b'hakoti be'eretz Mitzrayim. And the plague, which is coming to destroy in all of Egypt, will not come upon you when I see the sign of the blood upon your houses, right? Anybody who has ever attended a Seder knows this scene, right? This is the meaning of the holiday of Pesach, right? So, of course, everybody knows, what is ufasachti? I will pass over you, right? Hence the English name of the holiday, Passover, right? I will pass over you, and the plague will not enter the homes of B'nei Yisrael. Okay. We're going to get back to both the meaning of Pesach as a noun, as the name of the sacrifice in Pasuk Yud Aleph, as well as the meaning of the verb Pesach in Pasuk Yud Gimel. We'll get back to that in a moment. I just want to take note of what is in Pasuk Yud Bet in the middle, and that I'll read. It's not on your screen, but I'll read from the Tanakh I have in front of me. In the middle of these two things, right after Hashem tells them you have to be ready to go out the door and you're going to be eating this Pesach sacrifice hastily, and then afterwards where he describes that Hashem will be passing over B'nai Yisrael and the plague will not come upon them. In the pasuk in the middle it says, "Va'avarti be'eretz Mitzrayim balayla hazeh." I will pass through the land of Egypt on this night. V'hikeiti kol bechor be'eretz Mitzrayim me'adam va'ad behima. I will smite all of the firstborn of Egypt, both people as well as animals. Uvechol Elohei Mitzrayim eseh shvatim. I will also do all sorts of things against the gods of Egypt. Ani Hashem, I am God. So smack in the middle of these two psukim, which introduce the term Pesach, in Pasuk Yud Aleph and Pasuk Yud Gimel, is the actual description of the plague of Makat Bechorot, of the killing of the firstborn of Egypt. Okay, so one senses the manner in which this final plague, right, Makat Bechorot, is entwined with the redemption, the salvation of the people, and the sacrifice which they give, both of which enable them to leave Egypt, right? So what we're seeing in front of us is a very, very complicated situation. I hesitate always, not just in this class, but in all classes, to compare biblical story to more current events, because I find that often that leads to lack of subtlety in understanding of situations and overstatement, let's say. But let's just suffice to say that we are no strangers today, unfortunately, to the need for salvation and the need for victory on the one hand, and also the complicated situations that often bring that about. And I think that part of the message of this intertwining is not simply that we are the victors, but that there are certain things that are expected of us if the story is going to lead to a conclusion that is in our favor. Okay, so these are the psukim, the central psukim. First of all, of Makat Bechorot, but also the events that are surrounding Makat Bechorot, and it's actually the events surrounding the plague that I want to concentrate on, right? Less the plague itself and more what is going on with Am Yisrael at that same moment, and what is the message? What are we learning about all of the various events of that night? Okay. I now want to take a closer look at the usage of the root Pei Samech Chet, right? Which, as I pointed out, is once a verb and once a noun, to try to understand a little bit better what that root means and how it is being used in these psukim. And I'm going to look at the psukim themselves, but I also want to take a look at Rashi's interpretation, which is going to be central to what we're going to learn tonight. Not because I think that Rashi's interpretation is the only way, or that we always have to go by Rashi, but I feel that he does something, first of all, which is very interesting in his commentary here, and also, in the end of the day, also very meaningful, right? It lends a lot of meaning to the events of Yetziat Mitzrayim and of this particular moment of Yetziat Mitzrayim, which I think can, be a nice message to take with us. Okay, so I'm actually going to start with Pasuk Yud Gimel, which is the second of the psukim that we looked at, even though obviously it's out of order. And that is because I think it's the more familiar pasuk, meaning in terms of certainly how Rashi is going to look at it, but it's the one that we're more familiar when we talk about the story of Pesach. So again, it says that the blood will be upon their houses as a sign, so that Hashem will know which houses not to go into with the plague. Ufasachti alechem, right? I will pass over you. Now, as I mentioned before, that is the understanding of ufasachti that everybody knows, right? Ad kedei kach, right? So much so that the English translation of the name of the holiday is Passover, right? As I mentioned before. Interestingly, the name Passover for some reason is an English name which I think is used very often among English-speaking people, as opposed to like other names of holidays, right? Passover, I think, is much more used than, let's say, the name Tabernacles for the holiday of Sukkot. I'm not sure, maybe because it emphasizes this particular meaning of the events, this particular understanding of what was going on in that night of Yetziat Mitzrayim. But as we'll see in the Rashi that we're about to look at, Passover, I will pass over, is not the only way to understand what Hashem was doing that night. So, in fact, although Rashi is going to give the familiar interpretation in the end, he first brings a different interpretation, which I will say as an aside, is actually an understanding of the word of fasachti that some people claim is actually the pshat, is actually the simplest meaning of the word. I'm not here to decide one way or the other, but let's see what Rashi has to say. Ufasachti uchamalti, which means I will have compassion for you, right? So that when we read the pasuk, the idea is not that God is jumping over, passing over, but rather that God is having compassion, right? It's describing not the physical action, which, it's kind of funny when thinking about God in general, although, it could be that we're talking about an angel of God, and which makes it a little bit more palatable. But in all cases, compassion. Now, in the end of the day, I'm not sure that it makes that much of a difference, meaning the final result is that God is not bringing the plague upon B'nei Yisrael as opposed to the Egyptians. But according to Rashi's first interpretation that he brings, Pasachti means chamalti, I will have compassion upon you. And he brings a pasuk from Yeshayahu, which could be interpreted in that manner. We'll see in a moment that he also brings that same pasuk to back up his second interpretation. But his point is here that you could read this pasuk from Yeshayahu as meaning to have compassion. Okay. And then he says, Rashi, Va'ani omer, right? I say, meaning Rashi here is saying what he believes is the proper interpretation, which might be the reason that we all know this interpretation. This is the interpretation that won, so to speak, in the popular understanding of the story, because Rashi has a very big role in how we read biblical text, right? Va'ani omer, I say, kol psicha, every time the word psicha is used, like the verb of Pasach, lashon dilug ukfitza. What is meant is skipping and jumping. Two words that mean very similar things. Rashi has a tendency when he's giving translation of things or explanation of words to use two different words to try to get at what he's trying to say. You can see this a lot in Rashi's interpretation. Dilug ukfitza, skipping and jumping. So what does that mean? Ufasachti, and I will poseach, medaleg hayam mibatei Yisrael lebatei Mitzrayim. He would skip from the houses of B'nei Yisrael to the houses of the Egyptians. Shehayu shvuyin ze b'toch ze, right? The houses of the Egyptians and of Yisrael were next to each other. So they would skip from the houses of Yisrael, not going into them, and go into the houses of the Egyptians, of the Mitzrayim. And then he brings a whole bunch of psukim. I'm not going to go into each one just for the sake of time. A bunch of different psukim, which all can be all either must be read as skipping and jumping, or can be. So if you look at the very end, right, it's the same pasuk from Yeshayahu Lamed Aleph Hey, right, which, again, we're not looking at inside, but you'll trust me on this, can be read as meaning to skip and to jump. It can be read as to mean to have compassion, but can also be read as to mean to skip over something. Now, if you think about it again, if you're skipping over somebody when you're doing bad things to others, so that's it's a way of having compassion. So again, the two are not, in the practical sense, are not so far from each other. But the other psukim that he brings here, can only be read as meaning skipping and jumping. So, for example, he brings a pasuk from the Book of Kings, Melachim Aleph, Perek Yud Chet, where Eliyahu, the prophet, says to the people who are jumping back and forth between worshiping God and worshiping an idol, the Baal, and saying, Ad matay atem poschim al shtei hasifim. Until when are you going to jump back and forth from the two branches? Meaning you jump between worshiping Hashem and worshiping idols. So in that pasuk, poschim can only mean to jump. And so Rashi brings these psukim as a way of proving his second interpretation. Okay, and again, this is the famous interpretation. This is the interpretation that everybody knows, right? That Hashem is jumping over the houses of B'nei Yisrael, in order that the plague not go into their homes. And this is so much the popular understanding that it's basically codified in the Haggadah, right? When in the part of the Magid, of where we're telling the story of the Exodus from Egypt, when we get to the point where we're explaining what is Pesach, what is Matzah, and what is Maror, right? The interpretation of what Pesach means basically brings the second interpretation in Rashi. Okay, now, sorry, we're going to go back to here for one more second. So what do we have here? We have an image of God who is midaleg v'kofetz. He is skipping and he is jumping, right? On that very important night of Yetziat Mitzrayim. That is the action that Hashem is doing. And again, this is the common understanding of what's going on. This is not a great surprise to anybody who's familiar with the story. But now I want to look at Pasuk Yud Aleph, okay, which is the other time that we use the verb, the root Pesach. But here it's the noun of the korban Pesach. Okay, so again, let's just read it to refresh our memory. וככה תאכלו אותו, מותניכם חגורים, נעליכם ורגליכם ומקלכם בידכם, right? You should be all dressed and ready to go out the door. ואכלתם בחיפזון, you should eat it, the korban, with haste. Pesach hu la'Hashem, it is the Pesach sacrifice for God. Okay, so Rashi says here, bechipazon. So first he's understanding this phrase, bechipazon. Lashon behala umehirut. It is a word which implies speed and also kind of like being, almost like harried, right? Rushing to get out the door. And then he brings psukim, which are also examples of the word chipazon, which indicate rushing and being harried in that manner. But then he goes on to explain the phrase Pesach hu la'Hashem. It is a Passover sacrifice for God. HaKorban karui Pesach. The name of the korban is Pesach, right? The korban Pesach. It is this Pesach sacrifice. Why is it called the korban Pesach? Al shem hadilug shehakadosh baruch hu medaleg batei b'nei Yisrael sheben batei Mitzrayim v'kofetz mimitzrayim lemitzrayim. Right? V'Yisrael emtzai nimlat. Right? So far nothing is new. Why is it called korban Pesach? Because of the dilug and the kfitza, the jumping and skipping, or the skipping and jumping that Hashem was doing, right? Jumping from Egyptian house to Egyptian house and skipping over, passing over, jumping over, choose your verb, the house of B'nei Yisrael in the middle. Right, so far, nothing new. We've heard this all before. But then he goes on, Rashi, to say, apparently explaining the phrase Pesach hu la'Hashem, right? It is a Pesach for God. Ve'atem, you, B'nei Yisrael, asu kol avodatav, you should do your service to God, all of this, the service of the Pesach sacrifice, you should do derech dilug ukfitza, by way of skipping and jumping. Zecher lishmo shekaroi Pesach. You should, while you are doing the service of the Pesach sacrifice, you should be jumping and skipping, right? As a kind of tribute to the name of the sacrifice, which is Pesach, because of the skipping and the jumping that Hashem is doing, right? So this, I think, is new, right? We all know that Hashem is posech on the houses of B'nei Yisrael during this plague, so that they won't have the plague upon them, right? That everybody knows. But here, Rashi is saying something new, that Hashem isn't the only one who is skipping over, jumping over, passing over, right? It is B'nei Yisrael also who, while they are, who are doing the service of the korban Pesach, derech dilug ukfitza, in a manner of jumping and skipping, right? So this is very interesting, right? Because this isn't something that we didn't know before, right? In what way are B'nai Israel doing dilug ukfitza? Where do we have any indication that they too are posech, that they are also doing this Pesach thing of dilug and kfitza, right? But it is clear, right, that Rashi is trying to make a parallel here between what Hashem is doing over the houses of B'nai Yisrael and what B'nai Yisrael are doing within their homes, right? He's doing dilug ukfitza over their houses, and they, inside their homes, while doing the korban Pesach, are also doing dilug ukfitza. And so the question is, what is Rashi trying to do here? Why is he painting this picture of B'nai Yisrael also doing dilug ukfitza, and where, after all, does he get this idea from? So many of the interpretations on Rashi, and there are many, some of them suggest that what Rashi is doing here is interpreting or giving or painting a picture, let's say, of the word chipazon, right? When it says that they have to eat the korban bechipazon, ve'achaltem oto bechipazon, right? Rashi is explaining you have to do it derech dilug ukfitza, right? Because when we are rushing, right, if we're harried and hassled and need to get out the door and we're doing the korban Pesach and getting ready to go all at the same time, right? So you can picture in your mind, I can certainly see it in my home, right, that people are kind of really jumping around and they're kind of like all over the place, right? So this dilug ukfitza, this jumping around is kind of reminiscent or parallel to the dilug ukfitza that Hashem is doing above their homes. So in other words, when he says that they, B'nai Yisrael, have to do the avodah, the service of the korban Pesach, by way of dilug ukfitza, by skipping and jumping, it's an explanation of what it means, va'achaltem oto b'chipazon. So the whole pasuk is now read, va'achaltem oto b'chipazon, you will eat the korban Pesach in haste. Pesach hu Hashem. It is a jumping and skipping that you are doing for God, right? So it's kind of like two parallel interpretations simultaneously, I think, that Rashi is suggesting here. It is the korban Pesach for God, but it is also a jumping and a skipping that you are doing. You're specifically doing a korban of Pesach, of skipping and jumping for God, right? In way of tribute of what God is doing above your homes. Okay, so I want to take it a little bit further and to try to understand a little bit more deeply. Okay, so what does that mean? What has Rashi added here? So I think that first of all, as we've already noted, so Hashem is somehow saying that this action of skipping, of jumping, right, is not something just that God is doing. It's also something that B'nai Yisrael are doing. But if we're going to make a parallel between the actions of Hashem and the actions of the people, right? Then the parallel needs to be expanded in all ways. If the people are jumping and skipping, and this is an expression of their chipazon, of their haste, then that must mean as well that Hashem, when he is jumping and skipping, right, that is an expression of the haste of Hashem, right? That HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself is also rushing to have this event occur. And that precisely is what we see when we look at Rashi's source. Now, Rashi very often, more often than not, far more often than not, takes his ideas from the Midrash. He does not, however, take anything and everything from the Midrash. He specifically, we'll talk a little bit more about this later, he specifically takes things which he feels could in some way fit into the simple meaning of the pasuk. This does not mean that every interpretation that he brings from the Midrash is pshat, right? The simple meaning, in the sense that we would think of pshat, right? That, the simplest, I'll call more modern, although that's not quite an accurate way of understanding a verse. A lot of his ideas are midrashic in the sense that it's not the absolute simplest way of looking at it, but almost always Rashi's interpretation can be linked in a way to the verse itself. I hesitate to say never, but I would say he almost never brings an interpretation which, comes out of nowhere and you cannot figure out how he can fit it into the pasuk. Now, what we're going to see here is that Rashi takes something which actually there's a little bit of a complication of seeing it in the pasuk, but he finds a very clever and interesting way to fit it in, and why he does that we will discuss at the end. Okay, so the source of this idea in Rashi comes from Mechilta de Rabbi Ishmael. Mechilta de Rabbi Ishmael was a midrash, what's called a midrash halacha, meaning that most of the midrash, this is from the time of the Tanaim, right? The same rabbis who wrote the Mishnah, who are in the Mishnah. Most of what's in Mechilta is legal midrashim, dealing with the legal portions of the Torah. But in between and in the sections of the text that are more stories, so the Mechilta has also what we would call legends, midrashe agadah, which deal with the story sections of the midrash of the text. The Mechilta is specifically on the book of Shemot, which is of course where our psukim are from. So in the Mechilta de Rabbi Ishmael on our psukim, there's a discussion of when it says v'achaltem oto bechipazon, right? When you have to eat it with haste. Whose haste are we talking about? Who's rushing? So one interpretation is the obvious one, that we're talking about B'nei Yisrael. But then the Midrash says, but we see in other psukim, this is a very midrashic thing. We see that elsewhere, where the Torah tells us that they were eating in haste, right? There's a pasuk in Sefer Dvarim in this particular case. So why does it have to tell us twice? If it's telling us in Sefer Dvarim, so why is it telling us here? Let's not get into the technicalities of why that might be outside of midrashic thinking. Right, so they suggest, okay, maybe it's the chipazon of the Egyptians. Maybe it's the Egyptians who are acting in haste here. And of course, that's also part of the story where once Makat Bechorot happened, right? So the Egyptians are pushing B'nei Yisrael to leave Egypt, right? Because they've finally realized that they need to go. And so the second opinion suggests that it's the chipazon Mitzrayim, right? It's the Egyptians who are acting in haste. And then there's argument back and forth as to which one. And then finally, there's a third opinion, which is what's on the screen in front of us. Abba Hanan Mishum Rabbi Elazar, right? So Abba Hanan says the name of Rabbi Elazar. Zeh chipazon shechina. The chipazon of this pasuk is the chipazon of God Himself, right? And even though there's no proof, no textual proof in the story to this, zecher ledavar. There's a hint to this. Okay, and what is the hint? Well, first of all, what does it mean that there's no proof? What the Midrash is saying is that there's no pasuk in Sefer Shemot that says that Hashem was acting in haste. It's not there. Look through the story, and you will see that it does not exist there. But Abba Hanan, in the name of Rabbi Elazar, says there is a hint, but not in the book of Shemot. There's a hint somewhere else, and that hint is in the book of Shir HaShirim, which you might be aware that the book of Shir HaShirim, which is essentially a collection of love poems, has always been traditionally interpreted as a love story between Hashem and Am Yisrael. And there are many different interpretations of how, both in Midrash and in later commentaries, as to how exactly the parable, right, the love story is meant to be understood. Like, in what way is each pasuk referring to a different aspect of the story of Am Yisrael and Hashem? So, according to on the Mechilta de Rabbi Shmuel, this opinion that's being brought here, the hint is from the pasuk of Shir HaShirim Bet. Kol dodi hine zeba, the voice of my beloved, here it comes. And we'll see the full pasuk in a moment, right? But here it's talking about, right, in the book of Shir HaShirim, you have the Dod, who is the male beloved, and the Ra'ayah, who is the female beloved, and they are this loving couple, right? So kol dodi hine zeba, my beloved is coming, right? In this pasuk, which we will look at in a moment, the beloved is running over the hills to see her. And then the next pasuk says, "Va'omer hine ze omed achar kotleinu." Behold, he is standing on the other side of the wall. Okay. So in the interpretation of the Mechilta, these psukim we see here are referring to Hashem, who is running towards the Ra'ayah, indicating a chipazon, a kind of haste, in the way that a beloved will run towards his love. Okay, I just want to point out as a side point that people often think that Midrash, or the Ba'alei HaMidrash, the people who wrote and created the Midrashim, didn't have the understanding of the difference between Pshat and Drash. That when they bring these Midrashim, they think they don't differentiate between, like, what's the real, quote, meaning of the Psukim and what is the Midrashic reading of the Psukim. And here you see a beautiful example of clear awareness of the difference between Pshat and Drash, where Abba Hanan, in the name of Rabbi Elazar, is saying, right, even though there's nothing that explicitly says it in the pasuk, it's not the pshat, it's not written there, but there's a nice hint to it in Shir HaShirim, right? So they very clearly understand what pshat and what drash is. Just saying that as a side point. Okay, so what's the full pasuk that we see here, which of course is going to be very significant whenever you see a pasuk being quoted by a midrash. Always look at the full pasuk, because sometimes they're not written out as full, as we see here. And sometimes even you have to look a little bit beyond it, the pasuk before, the pasuk after, in order to appreciate fully what the Midrash is saying. What is the full pasuk? Kol dodi hine zeba, midaleg al heharim, mikapetz al hagvaot. Okay, here is my beloved jumping and skipping over the hills and over the mountains to his beloved. Okay, we'll get back obviously to that in a moment. And then the next pasuk is Domeh dodi l'tzvi u'le'ofer ha'ayalim. My beloved is like a gazelle, and like an ayal, like a deer. Hinei ze omed achar kotlenu, mashkiach min hachalonot, metzitz min hacharakim. He is standing on the other side of the wall, peeking through the windows and the spaces in the wall. Okay, so first of all, before we get into the details of why this pasuk is so significant in Rashi's interpretation, it is so first of all, the general scene, right, in the midrashic imagination, and which Rashi, of course, is, well, we'll get to Rashi in a moment. Let's stick with the midrash. The midrashic imagination, what you have here is the dod, the beloved, skipping and jumping, just like Hashem in Sefer Shemot, Poseach, who is skipping over, passing over, right? And of course, where is he? He's on the other side of the wall, while B'nei Yisrael are hidden inside their houses, right? Within the walls of their homes. Hashem is on the outside, skipping and jumping, right? Being Poseach over them. Okay, so that's the imagery, the link that the Midrash generally is using to connect between this pasuk and what's going on in Sefer Shemot. But now let's go back to Rashi for a moment, right? Now Rashi, I mentioned, he would never use this as a direct proof of anything in his pasuk. He's never going to say, right, Hashem was jumping over B'nei Yisrael, that poseach means to jump over, as opposed to the other interpretation that he was having compassion over them. He would never say that. He would never use this as a proof for that, because this is not, there's nothing in the pasuk, meaning there's nothing in the pasukim in Shir HaShirim which explicitly says this is talking about Sefer Shemot, right? That's a midrashic interpretation of it, right? It's not something that you can claim is hard, fast evidence in the pasuk in Shemot. But it's clear that when Rashi, and I'll go back to the interpretation of Rashi now, when he twice, both when explaining the verb pasachti and also when explaining the noun Pesach, uses the verbs dilug ukfitza, right? That Hashem is, what is psicha? Lashon dilug ukfitza, skipping and jumping. Or in the case of the korban Pesach, that they had to do the korban Pesach, derech dilug ukfitza, those exact verbs, there's no question that he gets it from this pasuk in Shir HaShirim, Kol dodi nezeba midaleg al heharim, mekapetz al hagvaot. And by using those in his interpretation, he's not using the midrash as proof for his understanding of the pasuk, but he's paying homage to it, right? He's saying, he's alluding to that midrash, saying, I know that midrash is there, and the midrash is kind of like in the background. I'm not going to use it as proof because that's not the way that I do interpretation, but it's there. I'm aware that it's there, and I am hinting to it in my interpretation, right? But what does Rashi do then? He isn't able to say that when it says that when it says that Hashem is poseach, that means that Hashem had chipazon, because there's nothing in the pasuk, there's nothing in the word poseach that necessarily means chipazon, that necessarily means haste. But what he's able to do is say, Hashem is poseach, and then according to the pasuk, B'nei Yisrael have to eat b'chipazon Pesach hu Hashem. Pesach hu Hashem, meaning they have to do their avodah for God in a manner of Pesach, in the manner of dilug ukfitza. So just as their dilug ukfitza was chipazon, so too was Hashem's Pesach, his being poseach, an act of chipazon, right? So that so he very cleverly, Rashi, takes this midrashic idea, which he doesn't feel that he can honestly use. He can't use that midrash as any sort of proof to say that God was rushing, that Hashem also was acting in haste to bring about the redemption of B'nei Yisrael. But he cleverly reworks it with this very original interpretation of the pasuk, of the second pasuk, of the idea of Pesach hu Hashem, meaning that B'nei Yisrael were being poseach and Hashem was being poseach, meaning that therefore both of them were being poseach in a manner of chipazon. Okay, so he very cleverly reworks the midrashic idea in a way that he feels more comfortable saying that it is the pshat of the pasuk. Now, I'm also going to say as an aside, there's no time to really go into this in any sort of detail, that Rashi, the text of Rashi is a very complicated that right? There are many, many, many different versions of Rashi's commentary, meaning that there are manuscripts of Rashi's commentary. And the work of figuring out what was Rashi's original commentary is a very, very complicated thing. And in this particular case, some of the manuscripts have this idea of Pesach LaHashem, means that they had to do the korban in a manner of dilugu kvitza, and some don't. So the question remains as to whether that was part of Rashi's original commentary. It so happens that one of the most reliable manuscripts of Rashi's commentary includes it. So that's, first of all, a clue that this might actually be an original Rashi thought. But there's another proof, which I find even more interesting than the study of the manuscripts, and that is Rashi's interpretation of that very pasuk from Shir HaShirim. And in Rashi's commentary, which we're going to look at right now, on the pasuk from Shir HaShirim, you see this exact idea, that Rashi is trying to say that both B'nei Yisrael and Hashem were kind of rushing out the door together. So let's read this last source together. So again, the pasuk is, my beloved is coming, skipping over the hills and jumping over the mountains or over the hills. Okay, chozer hamisharer al harishonot. Right. So Rashi says in this pasuk, the mishorer, meaning the poet who wrote Shir HaShirim, is going back to something he already talked about. כאדם שקיצר דבריו וחוזר ואומר, like a person who initially said something, but said it in a very brief way, וחוזר ואומר, לא אמרתי לפניכם ראשית דברים. And now he's going back and says, I didn't tell you really sufficiently what was going on at the beginning, right? He said it very briefly, and now he says, in this pasuk, Kol Dodi Hinei Zeba Medaleg Al Harim Mekabetz Al Gvot, I'm now explaining to you a little bit more carefully what I said earlier. So what did he say earlier? So in Perek Aleph of Shir HaShirim, right, our pasuk is in Perek Bet. In Perek Aleph, it says, Hu itchil ve'amar, Mashcheni acharecha narutza. Right, the woman of Shir HaShirim says to her beloved, to the Dod, Mashcheni, pull me, acharecha, pull me after you and we will run, right? Let's run together. Pull me after you and I will run with you, okay? Heviani hamelech chadarav, right? And it says the king then brought me into his chambers, okay? But on the part of the pasuk, Mashcheni acharecha narutza, pull me and we will run together. And that's what it says in Perek Aleph. V'lo siper heach pokdam b'Mitzrayim. Right? There was no in that pasuk. There's no indication of exactly how Hashem remembered them in Mitzrayim. Right? The Rashi is kind of jumping back and forth between mashal and nimshal, between the parable and the interpretation of the parable. Right? First, he's talking in the language of Shir HaShirim, and then he's going on to talk about B'nei Yisrael. But in that first initial pasuk, there's no details about how did Hashem remember them in Mitzrayim. How do you remember Mitzrayim? B'lashon chiba, with the language of love. V'achshav chozer ve'omer. Now in our pasuk, there's a little bit more detail. Mishicha zu, right? That pulling, right? In the first pasuk of Moshcheni acharecha narutza, what was that pulling, right? Where she says, pull me and I will run after you. Mishicha zu she'amarti, the pulling which I talked about, she'amarti lahem, she'moshcheni dodi veratzti acharav, that about during which I said that my beloved pulled me and I ran after him. This is how it happened. Okay, and so now they're explaining what does that mean that the woman said, "Pull me after you, and I will run with you." Right. So what is the interpretation of that? No ash hayiti omeret lageula ad tom 400 shana. I, meaning this is B'nei Yisrael talking. This is Am Yisrael talking. I was desperate speaking to the redemption until the end of 400 years. Right? Okay, so this is somewhat cryptic language in Rashi. So what is he saying? That Am Yisrael were desperate, and we're saying to the redemption, capital R, right? The redemption, what redemption? The redemption that was supposed to happen after 400 years of slavery, which was spoken about in Brit Ben HaBetarim. So what is that talking about? So back in the days of Avraham, there's this thing called Brit Ben HaBetarim, a covenant between the pieces, they say in English, where Hashem tells Avraham, right, you should know, Avraham, that your descendants will be strangers in a foreign land. And they will be slaves there, and they will work for 400 years. And then afterwards, they will be taken back, and we come back to the land. And there's Rashi is alluding here to the fact that that term 400 years is complicated, because it actually isn't 400 years. It's closer to 200 plus years, right? As is seen in other psukim which give that number, or numbers around that. So which was it? Was it 400 years or was it 200 years? And we don't have time in today's shiur to go into the ways of working out the problem with those two different things. 400 probably is a typological number of a long time, but nevertheless, there's a lot of interpretation in Rashi as well on these psukim. He tries to figure out, well, what does 400 mean, and he does calculations to explain the way he explains. But what does he say here? Right, the B'nei Yisrael were desperate. They're like, oh my God, 400 years, right? They were desperate for the Geulah to happen, and the Geulah was only going to be at the end of 400 years. Kol dodi hine zeba, right? Lifnei haketz. My beloved is coming, right? Before the appointed time. Lifnei haketz, before the end. Before we had to wait for 400 years. Kimidaleg, skipping, right? Skipping over time. Al heharim umekapetz al hagvaot, right? That, what is called Odihines about, where the beloved is coming, rushing, right? Trying to skip over time to bring the redemption sooner, right? In order that B'nei Yisrael, who were desperate to be redeemed at that point, could be redeemed. So B'nei Yisrael are saying, Moshcheni, come and pull me, and I will run out with you, right? And so Rashi shows in this pasuk that on the one hand, right, B'nei Yisrael are saying, Moshcheni, pull me, right? And the beloved comes, as explained here in this pasuk, midaleg al ha'arim mekapetz al hagvaot, skipping over time, running towards his beloved, in order that they run together towards the redemption, right? So B'nei Yisrael are desperate to leave, and they're rushing, but Hashem also, and they're saying to Hashem, pull me with you, and then Hashem comes and they rush out together, right? So in this interpretation of Shir HaShirim, of the Pasuk in Shir HaShirim, we see the exact understanding that Rashi kind of like reworks into the Psukim in Sefer Shmot, without needing to rely on the Midrashic reading of Shir HaShirim as talking about Sefer Shmot and applying it to Sefer Shmot. He sees it on the word Pesach, right? That they were jumping and skipping, and Hashem is jumping and skipping, and this is a sign of the rushing of the two of them to get the redemption going, and for B'nai Yisrael finally to leave. Rashi is known, even though he's known as trying to stick to the pshat, he's also known for emphasizing in his commentary certain themes that are very important to him. And one of the themes, for example, is Hashem's love for B'nai Yisrael. And another theme which comes up, and this might have something to do with the fact that he himself lived in a very complicated time period of the Crusades, the idea of the redemption of Israel. That sometimes, when redemption seems far away, that it will eventually come. And this is something that comes out very, very strongly here. And so it's possible that what Rashi is doing here in his interpretation in Sefer Shmot is sort of an intertextual reading of Shir HaShirim, which he understands is a different text, right? That he can't superimpose everything, every interpretation of the parable of Shir HaShirim. He can't force it on the psukim in Sefer Shemot, but he alludes to those psukim in his interpretation to say that even if the rushing of Hashem, or I'll add now, the love of Hashem for B'nei Yisrael is not written out explicitly in Sefer Shemot, I'm going to hint to it because I want you to understand that Shir HaShirim is an interpretation of the text, which is true, even if it's not expressed in full in the book of Shemot. And so that the idea that he's emphasizing here is this idea of, first of all, the love of Hashem for B'nai Yisrael, the desire of Hashem also to rush the redemption forward, just as much as B'nai Yisrael were desperate to have the redemption come about. Now, this all has to be seen together, and with this we'll end, with all of these other things, other understandings or other purposes of the chipazon, right? The chipazon of the people, was the haste in which they were doing the korban Pesach, their desire to rush, right, was a reflection of their willingness to follow Hashem, their willingness to declare themselves, to put this sign on their home that we are with God, that we see ourselves as a nation who is following God, right? And that is very clearly in the text of Sefer Shemot. And I think these two things together paint a very beautiful picture of what was going on at that time. And perhaps could also help us understand the nature in which it is intertwined with Makat Bechorot, right? Makat Bechorot, as difficult as it might be to read about this plague, right? It's the culmination of a very long process of Moshe and God trying to convince Pharaoh that the right thing to do is to let his people go. And Pharaoh doesn't let go, right? And so as difficult as it is, Makat Bechorot is not simply a random punishment. It is the culmination of a very long process where Pharaoh just doesn't give in and Pharaoh doesn't understand what he has to do. And finally, this is what has to happen in order to convince him to let B'nai Yisrael leave. And over again, Pharaoh stands against God, right? And this is, a big theme in the entire story of Yetziat Mitzrayim and of Pharaoh and of the Makot. And the purpose of the Makot, Pharaoh stands against God, saying, I do not know God, I do not follow God, I am not going to do what God tells me to do. And the result in the end is that he gets this terrible punishment, and his people suffer and get this terrible punishment. And the other side of the story, right, the story of the Pesach, both of Hashem and of B'nai Yisrael, is the flip side, that B'nai Yisrael are able to go because their willingness to say, we are a people of Hashem. We are the one who will follow Hashem, and we will follow the rules of Hashem, which are very counter to the laws and the rules and the way of doing things in Egypt and the way of Pharaoh's ruling over his people and over his slaves, right? And so by distinguishing themselves in that way and marking their homes as saying that we are dedicated to this thing, in stark contrast to what was going on in Egypt, that's what enables them to go out the door. And simultaneously, right, also the great desire to leave is and their willingness to rush out the door with all the complications and difficulties that would entail is what allowed it to finally happen. But together with that, there's also this very beautiful picture that Rashi kind of intertwines into this picture of the fact that as much as B'nai Yisrael want to leave, Hashem wants to help this to happen as well. And that way he brings in the relationship of Hashem and B'nai Yisrael and the love of Am Yisrael and Hashem in both directions, which as a way of understanding a full picture of what enabled B'nai Yisrael finally to leave and to leave Egypt behind. So in these days of complicated wishes for redemption and need to redeem people and to be victorious against those who wish to harm us. I think that it's also comforting to also see this aspect that Rashi brings in of, just when it seems that redemption is far away, and just when it seems that the love of Hashem or Hashem's desire to help us out of something is far away, that nevertheless it is part of the story, and we can read it in as part of the story. So I wish everybody Chag Sameach, and if anyone has any questions or comments, I'm happy to take a look at that now.
Thank you. Chag Sameach.
Thank
My
you.
pleasure.
Thank you for the excellent share. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Chag Sameach. All right. Chag Sameach to everybody.